Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar from the SFP Greater London Student Chapter. My name's Matt Bonner. I'm the treasurer of the chapter. Welcome. I hope you're all doing well. I'm sorry I can't see you, the nature of webinars now. Today we've got a really fascinating topic for you all. We've got Dr Antonio Cicione from South Africa, from Stellenbosch University. He'll be talking about his work on informal settlements, fires in informal settlements. It's some really interesting stuff. I'll introduce him properly in a moment, but first I'd just like to mention we've also got another of these webinars coming up on the 4th of November at 11 AM. That will be from Professor Carlos Fernandez Pello, and he will also be speaking to us. So that'll be really interesting. So please come along to that if you can. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Cicione. He's got a really interesting presentation for us today. So thank you so much for coming, Dr. Cicione, and please take it away.
Okay. Hi, thanks Matt for the introduction. I'm just going to share my screen then. Cool. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'll be talking a bit about informal settlement fire dynamics, or fires in informal settlement, and I hope you find it interesting. So let's have a quick overview of the presentation. So I'll quickly introduce the fire engineering research unit here at Stellenbosch. Then we'll look at what exactly are informal settlements and what are informal settlement dwellings. We'll then look at some statistics regarding informal settlement fires. We'll then look at what the key differences are between formal dwellings and informal dwellings, and how these affect the fire dynamics in them. I'll then show you some of the large-scale experiments that we've conducted to date, and lastly look at some of the numerical modeling that we are currently busy with. Okay, so the fire research unit at Stellenbosch is called Fire Sun, and we are the first fire engineering research group at postgraduate level in Africa. Currently, we have 2 postdoctoral researchers, 6 PhD students, and 9 master students, and all of them are doing research in fire-related topics. And here are just some of them: so building response in fire, fire modeling, both finite element and CFD modeling, and then also some full-scale steelwork testing. We recently conducted a 6x6 meter floor a novel sandwich floor system for the South African Institute of Steel Construction. Then also looking at building design codes, specifically with regards to fire, and to see whether our codes here in South Africa are up to date. And then obviously doing a lot of research in informal settlement fires. We've recently started with some 3D printed concrete in fire, and this is actually one of the areas that I'm involved in mostly these days. And then design of industrial facilities in fire, and the behavior of CLT in fire. Okay, so let's then jump straight into informal settlements. So informal settlements are unplanned settlements built on land which has not been proclaimed as residential. So here I have 2 figures. The one on the left is a satellite image or Google Earth image on 2014, and this open piece of land over here is in Cape Town, and just above this figure somewhere over here you have Cape Town International Airport. And I'm not 100% sure if this was privately owned land or government owned land, but what happens is someone will start building an informal settlement somewhere over there, and then the next person would start building them. And if the settlement or the dwellings are there for a couple of days, legally you're not allowed to remove them anymore. And then you can see within a single year, so this is 2015, the same piece of land, you have a full informal settlement with thousands of dwellings. And with the settlement popping up this quickly, it's really not possible for the government to add any sort of formal infrastructure to these settlements. So you don't have running water. Most or some settlements don't have electricity. The running water you do have is they install taps every few hundred meters. So each home won't have their own running water. You would have to walk to go get water from a tap or a river nearby and bring the bucket back home and use water in that way. So you can think now immediately how some first world solutions won't work in these settlements. So you get people proposing ideas to the government. For example, one of the favorites are adding a line of sprinklers to these settlements. First of all, every house don't have running water. Now, how do we add the sprinklers? You'll see that some of our fire hydrants won't even have sufficient pressure in these areas. So how do you ensure sufficient pressure for the sprinklers? So, and if one sprinkler fails, you still have fire spread. So first world solutions won't always work for settlements. Okay, so what are informal settlement dwellings then? So they are the makeshift structures that are typically built from materials that are immediately available within the surroundings of the inhabitants. So yeah, I've got 3 images of how a typical informal settlement dwelling would look. And here on the left, you can see how closely they are spaced. This is actually quite far for an informal settlement, the spacing, and they can get really close, even touching each other. And if we look here at the image in the middle, you can see that it's really poorly built in most cases, and it's not the best material. It is whatever they could find that's close by. So you have a lot of openings, small openings. So these openings create leakages, and through these leakages, flames can seep in or out, and it creates a fire spread mechanism. If we look at this image on the right, you can see that the dwellings are typically lined with some combustible material, and that's for insulation because you have really thin sheets being the boundary of the compartment, so they are really cold in winters. And then in terms of the fuel load, it really ranges. Here we only have a bed with a couple of clothes, so it's probably not a very high fuel load. However, you do get dwellings where people store spirits and gas canisters and run a small local business out of that, so that can be a very high fuel load. Okay, so if we quickly look at some statistics regarding informal settlements and informal settlement fires, we currently have about 7.5 billion people in the world, and of those 7.5, about 6.3 billion lives in lower middle income countries, and then of those, approximately 1 billion reside in informal settlements. It is, however, estimated that the population residing in informal settlements will grow substantially in the coming years. So by 2050, we'll have 1.2 billion people living in informal settlements in Africa alone. So it's really going to increase a lot in the next 30 years. If we then look at fire and fire-related death, so currently it's estimated that we have approximately 180,000 to 300,000 fire-related deaths per year, and of those 180,000 deaths, approximately 95% of those occurs in lower to middle income countries. If we look at any other natural hazards, which takes about 90,000 lives per year, you can see that fire is almost double that, or actually more than double that. So fire is quite deadly and quite dangerous, and a lot of those occur in low and middle income countries, unfortunately. So in South Africa, we have about 5,000 to 6,000 recorded informal settlement fires per year. So these are only the fires that gets reported to the authorities, so there might be more. And this is then about 14 informal settlement fires per day in South Africa. So that's quite a lot of informal settlement fires. And these fires can be really big, 2, 3, 4, 5,000 structures in a single fire incident. Okay, so this is just a quick case study, not very detailed, but just a quick overview of the Imizamietu fire. This occurred in 2017. So this particular fire destroyed almost 2,200 structures, leaving about 10,000 people homeless. So the fire started over here at this star, and the wind at that moment, the wind direction was up the hill in this direction. And as the fire reached the top of the settlement, the wind then turned directions going along the foot of the mountain. It then reached this eucalyptus trees, which just made the intensity of the fire so much worse. The wind changed direction again, and it started spreading down, almost jumping into the formal neighborhood over here. So these reddish roofs, these are the formal dwellings. This green line over here, that's the only access road into the settlement. And it's a very narrow, very steep road, and I'll show you a picture of that now. And as soon as you have a fire, everyone starts bringing their belongings to the road to try and evacuate and try and save their belongings. And the road gets blocked really quickly, and so there's no way for the brigade to get in there. So what often happens is they'll stop at the boundaries and they'll start running on top of the roofs to actually get to the fire. And then what also happens is they are strategically fighting the fire front, and a resident, just as a result of lack of knowledge, would see, okay, they're fighting the fire over there, but my house is over here and it's going to get destroyed. So in order to save their own house, they'll sometimes slash a hose to redirect water, and it's just because they don't understand why the firefighters are focusing on a certain area rather than another area. And then also you can see these yellow triangles represents fire hydrants. So this one over here, the fire brigades actually didn't find that this hydrant during the incident, and we think that someone built their house over that, and that's the reason why they couldn't get it. Then this fire hydrant over here, which was used a lot during this fire, had very low water pressure, making it really difficult. And then the one here at the bottom just didn't work. So you can see that the fire brigades, they do have a lot of challenges when it comes to fighting these fires. Yeah, and this photo, this is actually, I think this is a day or so after the fire. So you can see a lot of houses are already rebuilt. Okay, so these are just some images of the event. So if we look here at the top left, you can see the aftermath of the fire incident, and you can see some people already starting to rebuild their homes. If we have a fire in a formal house, typically the insurance company will pay for you to go live somewhere for that night and also pay for everything that you lost. For people living in informal settlements, that's not the case. You lose everything when you lose when your house burns down in a fire, and you have to start building straight away, because where are you going to live after this? Because your house is destroyed, you've got nowhere to go. And if you don't build straight away, someone else will build on your piece of land. So it's really, yeah, it's not nice, and yeah, it's something they have to do, unfortunately. The image here on the top right, you can see one of the firefighters on top of the roofs trying to put out the fire. And this is actually very dangerous. In a video that we are analyzing of an informal settlement fire, we saw a resident with a bucket of water on top of a roof trying to put out his fire on his dwelling. And then as he got down to go grab more water, suddenly there was a big explosion. So a gas canister or something exploded. Luckily, he wasn't on the roof anymore, but yeah, it is very dangerous on top of the roofs where you can't easily evacuate. You can also see how electricity looks within the settlements. You'll have some electricity pole, and everyone will then tap into this box to get electricity. So a lot of these connections are illegal. And then here this is a photo from the formal dwelling, so looking from below up towards the settlement. And then the bottom right, you'll see the access road that I talked about in the previous slide. So it's very narrow, very steep, and you have everyone putting all their belongings in the road and trying to evacuate. So there's no way for the brigade to use that road. Okay, so let's look at some of the differences now between formal and informal, just some of the main differences. So if we talk about the height from floor level to ceiling level in an informal room or enclosure, you typically have about 3 to 4 meters. So it's quite high. You have a lot of time for the hot layer to build up and start descending down before you can get to a stage where flashover occurs. For informal dwellings, it's very low, about 2.2, some cases even lower. Some dwellings are just above the height of the door, and that's just because it saves material, it's easier to build, you don't have ladders and stuff to build necessarily, so it's typically lower than a formal dwelling. In terms of the boundaries, for formal dwellings, you have thermally thick boundaries. For informal dwellings, you have thermally thin boundaries typically, and these thermally thin boundaries typically heat up a lot faster. They're not as well insulated as the thermally thick boundaries, and they start radiating back into the enclosures, specifically if the neighbor dwelling is on fire and it preheats your sheeting, it then starts heating up some of the materials even before ignition occurs. Then we also have leakages for informal structures, so you have these gaps all over, and as soon as you have a fire, the steel sheets or timber planks will burn away or buckle, and you have these leakages where flames can sip in or out. And then also lastly, we have highly combustible lining material. So typically the dwellings are lined with cardboard or timber, and it's usually a highly combustible, and you'll see that this plays an important role in the fire spread mechanism and also how quickly these dwellings reach a point, a fully developed stage. So here I have 2 videos, just one showing a formal fire in a formal enclosure, and then the other one of our experiments. So if I just skip to 1 minute here and we look at the formal fire, so someone started the fire there in the corner, you already have a lot of combustibles involved, the couch is already burning, this chair is already burning, and it's ignited in a really bad place, so in the corner with a lot of combustibles. So we expect this to reach flashover really quickly. For formal structures, we all know the more material burns, the more material gets involved in the fire, the more combustion gases are released and the more hot gases are released. And these hot gases then accumulate at ceiling level. And as soon as we have enough hot gases at ceiling level and the corresponding radiation to floor levels enough, we then get to a point where we can have flashover. So which should happen any minute now. We can see that's quite a nice hot layer at the moment. Now we have flames in there. You'll soon, we can see some of the material starts to pyrolysize, and we then have flashover. So let's just have a look. Yeah, pyrolysis and then flashover. Okay, and that's 2.5 minutes. That's fairly quickly for a formal structure. If we then look at an informal dwelling, so I don't have a video that's as nice as this one for informal settlements. So these are one of our experiments. We have a GoPro inside. It's lined with it's lined with cardboard, and you only have 2 timber cribs in the middle of the dwelling. So this is approximately 30 seconds after ignition. And ignition occurred here at the very top of the dwelling. So this is the cameras looking from floor level up towards the ceiling. So the flame spread, opposed flame spreads a lot slower than concurrent flame spread, so we know that. So this is ignited at the top, so you have slow development at the beginning, but you'll see it's still relatively fast. If we ignited this at the bottom, it would have been a lot faster to flash over, but let's have a look. So you'll see the cardboard burns, and then as soon as you have sufficient heat, all the cardboard will ignite. So if you have a look here at the left, you'll see the rest of the cardboard igniting, and then once we have sufficient cardboard burning, it's just flash over straight away. So the energy from the cardboard or whatever combustible material is used for lining is really enough to cause flash over, even if the hot layer isn't 500 or 600, what we usually use for formal structures. Okay, so let's look at some of the results. So these are, so here we have incident heat flux versus time on the left, and on the right we have temperature versus the time temperature curve, also for informal dwelling. So if you first look at the heat flux versus time, you'll see that just before we reach a fully developed stage, we have this peak in heat flux. So the blue curve here is 1.5 meters in front of a door. So this peak was for a case where we ignited the cardboard at the very top. So you had a very slow spread initially, and some of the cardboard then burns away before you have all of the lining material involved. However, if we do that the other way around, if we ignite it at the bottom, like we'll have in a dwelling of origin perhaps, you then get a really large peak, and we saw this in a lot of our experiments, where the peak that corresponds with the cardboard burning is quite significant, and this peak can most certainly cause fire to spread from one dwelling to another dwelling. So you can have fire spread as soon as you have that cardboard burning, and you're just seconds before you enter a fully developed stage. If we look at the time temperature curve here on the right, you'll see that it's very similar to what we'll find in a formal dwelling. We still have ignition, we still have some growth period, we then have flashover, and we still have a fully developed stage, and we typically also have a decay stage. However, instead of the decay stage being a changing burning regime from ventilation control to fuel controlled, we typically have structural collapse for informal settlement dwellings, which I also see as a sort of a decay stage. In terms of the fully developed stage, we also have a ventilation typically also have a ventilation controlled fully developed stage with the maximum temperatures and heat release rates. And we also have temperatures very similar to formal dwellings. I think it might be slightly lower. If we then look at growth and flashover, the main difference we have here is that instead of the majority of the radiation coming from the hot layer and from whatever combustible was burning at the very start, you have the radiation from the lining material that catches fire very soon or easily. And then you also have the radiation from your boundaries, especially if it's not the dwelling of origin, but the target dwelling. The sheeting might have been preheating for a few minutes, so you have whatever is inside the dwelling already being preheated because of the radiation from the sheets. Okay, so let's look at some of our experiments. So here we have two experiments, so 3 steel-clad dwellings and 3 timber-clad dwellings, and we just wanted to see what the main differences are between the steel-clad dwellings and the timber-clad dwellings. For the steel-clad dwellings, the main spread mechanism is flame impingement onto the cardboard. The cardboard then, or the flames then creeps down the cardboard. As soon as we have enough cardboard burning, we have flashover. And then for the timber dwellings, this fire was really intense. We actually scared the fire brigade on the day. We were scared ourselves. We thought, okay, we're going to burn down something here at the back. And we had these firebrands going everywhere. We had a fire wool, and everything was just burning here. So it is really intense. And you'll find here that as soon as the dwelling reaches a fully developed stage, the timber cladding will create some gaps. You can see it over here. And then very soon after that, you'll have the entire dwelling burning like you have over here. So this is really not great for fire and the timber-clad dwellings. And if we think about this, then also other fire spread interventions, we can think that they won't work if we see this. For instance, a lot of people have proposed intumescent paint. So even if we forget about the fact that everything should be perfect for you to apply intumescent paint without it falling off. So you have to have clean sheets, it needs to be prepped properly, and then you can apply the intumescent paint and it won't fall off. Let's say everything was done perfectly, you still have the gaps as a result of the corrugation, and the sheeting will still buckle and create gaps. So you'll still have flames impinging onto the cardboard even if you have intumescent paint swelling up, right? So it's just not a good solution for informal settlements. And if you have timber-clad dwellings, I really don't know what you'll do. Even if you have a fireboard or whatever on the inside of your timber-clad dwelling, I really don't see that stopping the fire spread. Okay, so we went a bit bigger, and we did a 12 dwelling experiment. So initially we wanted the wind to come from this side, going so top left to bottom right, and unfortunately on the day it happened that the wind was the other way around, and we set up the experiment to ignite these two dwellings simultaneously, and we still went ahead with that. So these results aren't published yet, but hopefully it will give us some very good insights regarding how fire spreads against the wind versus how fire spreads with the wind, which we'll see in the next experiment. So something that's quite interesting here is that because we ignited these two dwellings at the same time, we did a small variation in the boundary conditions between the two dwellings. So between these two dwellings, we actually stuffed all the leakages with ceramic blanket. And then between these two dwellings, we just left the openings or the leakages like you would typically do in an informal settlement. And it was actually interesting to see that fire spread did not occur from this dwelling to this dwelling, but rather it spread it from this dwelling to that dwelling to this dwelling. So just covering the leakages makes a huge difference, even though the steel sheet that separates the two dwellings still got really hot. The fire spread was quicker this way around than by conduction through the sheets. We did the same here on the edges, where we had one big piece of ceramic blanket between the two dwellings. You can actually see that piece sticking out, and fire did not spread from this one to that one, and the same here did not spread from that one to this one, but rather found different ways to get to those dwellings. Okay, so then we went a bit bigger, and we did the 20 dwelling experiment. So these results are published. So if you want to have a look at that, you're welcome to. We ignited the 4 dwellings here simultaneously to create some sort of fire front and see how it then spreads through the dwelling. So I'll show a video of that. So yeah, as I mentioned, so we ignited these 4 dwellings at the same time. The small settlement was made up of timber-clad dwellings and steel-clad dwellings. So the highlighted ones are the timber-clad dwellings. And if you are willing to comment, or in the comment section, I don't know if I think there's a comment section, it would be good to see what you think the dwelling would be with the highest temperature. It would be quite interesting to know what your thoughts are before we look at the results. So yeah, these are the timber dwellings. So you can just, if you want to comment, or just you can think about it on your own if you want to. So yeah, we have row A and then or row 1, column A. So you can just say A1, for example, if you want to. Okay, so yeah, the timber-clad dwellings, then the ones that's highlighted in grey now, that's the steel-clad dwellings, and we had different spacings, so 1.2 meters and 2.2 meters at some places. So this is just a back view of the experiment, so looking from the back to the experiment, and here we just have how it looks between dwellings, and we added these boards at the end to give it a feel of a real settlement. So we didn't want the boundaries to be open, so we had these freestanding walls, and then inside we just had the cardboard and the timber cribs representing the fuel load inside. Okay, so let's look at the drone footage, which I think will start now. Okay, so here we have an overhead drone. So we ignited the 4 dwellings. So this video is now times 10 the speed, but you have a real time stamp here at the bottom right. So you'll see 1 minute, we already have the first dwellings reaching a fully developed stage. 2 minutes, we already have the second line of dwellings ignited. 2.5 minutes, some of the third line. 3 minutes, basically everything in the third line ignited. 3.5 minutes, we are getting to this dwelling igniting. 4 minutes, we have both of these ignited, and I think that one as well. And at about 5 minutes, we have all of the dwellings involved. So that's quite scary, 5 minutes, 20 dwellings. And you'll see that some of the timber clad dwellings are starting to collapse. So they burn for about 5 minutes. As soon as the timber planks burns away, you then just have some sway collapse because they don't have bracing anymore. And the steel clad dwellings takes about 7 to 10 minutes to collapse. The interesting thing now here to note is this dwelling still standing over here. This was the steel clad dwelling in between 4 timber clad dwellings. And initially we thought this dwelling was going to go like a bomb just because you have the 4 timber dwellings surrounding it, and there's going to be so much radiation to this dwelling. We really thought this is going to be the worst case, and actually the temperatures in this dwelling was the lowest. I think it's just because you have the timber clad dwellings burning and consuming all the oxygen, leaving almost no oxygen for that steel clad dwelling. So the burning is less severe in that. So this is just a side view of the experiment. Here you can see how the timber clad dwelling look. I think another one over there. There we have timber clad dwelling. So they burn away pretty quickly. And then as soon as the cladding is burned through, you have collapse. Okay, so at the end of last year, we did a series of experiments. So we did 9 in total, both consisting of 2 dwellings. We had a first dwelling. So if we look at this image here on the right, we had this first dwelling that we tried to keep as reproducible as possible. So we didn't line it with cardboard. We only had 1 opening, and we really tried to keep this fire similar for all 9 experiments. And then every time we change something small with the second dwelling, trying to look at all the nitty-gritties and try and really understand how the fire spreads. And then we also did our first double-story experiment. So you can see here on the left how that looks. It's also quite a scary fire. We let it burn for I think about 3 or 4 minutes, and then the fire brigade put it out. And it was really difficult to collapse this dwelling afterwards as well. So it's not easy to pull it over if you have to, and it's quite dangerous actually. Okay, so from our results, we can try and validate or benchmark some of the current equations we have within the fire engineering community. So we actually found that the normal equation for radiation, so we have the Stephan-Boltzmann coefficient, configuration factor, emissivity, and temperature of the emitter. It actually predicted the radiation that we measured during the experiment quite well. And then also using the flux time product, we could predict the time to ignition with our experimental results pretty well. And then the hope is that we can use some of these equations, we can generalize them and simplify them, and ultimately use them in some sort of statistical fire spread model where the results can actually be useful for local municipalities and firefighters. But just then, as an interesting thing that we found using these equations were critical separation distances. So how far do these dwellings need to be apart for them not to ignite? So if we look at the graph here with the figure on the left, and we look at the pink graph, for example, so we have a single dwelling burning, so our dwelling of origin being a single story dwelling, and then our target dwelling being lined with timber. then we need approximately 2.8 meters for the second dwelling not to catch fire. So this is for a very specific single story configuration, and it's also assuming no wind. So this might change based on the dwelling configuration. The curve might move to the left or to the right. And if we have wind, the curve will shift to the right as well. If we now change the target dwellings lining material from timber to cardboard, you can see we move from the pink to the blue. So suddenly you need 3.1 meters for the fire not to spread. If we change the dwelling of origin from a single story to a double story, and we look here at the green, you can see now we need more than 4 meters for that not to catch fire. So that just gives you an idea of the spaces you would need between dwellings, and this is not always possible in informal settlements, because who do you move, where do you move them to, and if there is an open space and a family member visits whoever lives there, they would just extend their home into that open space. Otherwise, someone else will take it. Okay, so like I mentioned, the hope is that we can start using these equations in statistical fire spread models to produce risk maps of real informal settlements, and I'll show you some of the work that we've been doing regarding that. Okay, so some numerical modeling that we've been doing. So here we have those experiments that we did last year, where we had 2 dwellings that I just showed you, and we had a lot of wind, and we're trying to see whether we can reproduce the experimental results and whether we can capture the wind behavior and the fire behavior accurately. And I have to say, I'm actually quite impressed with how well FDS is capturing this. It's surprisingly well. It always feels weird when a model actually captures results, right? But a lot of people will ask me, why would we want to go as complex as FDS for informal settlement fires where you have so many unknowns already? And the answer to that is, one, if we can benchmark FDS against all of our experiments, we can look at parametric studies and then really try and identify the parameters that influences fire spread the most. So that's where we then need to focus on. We can also get outputs from FDS that we can use as inputs for a statistical fire spread models that can ultimately help us produce accurate risk maps. However, there are some challenges with FDS specifically. I'm not sure if we'll have the same challenges with other CFD software. For example, in reality, we have very thin lining material, the cardboard being a few millimeters. However, in FDS, it's not realistic to have a mesh size that's 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters. It's just not practical. So you have to have the cardboard being thick, at least 1 cell size thick. And this then creates challenges regarding how quickly it spreads over the surface and how long it takes for that cardboard to ignite. Then also simulating the leakages, that's also difficult because you have a lot of small leakages and you don't have the mesh, you can't make the mesh size that small to accurately model the leakages. We also have a continuous change of ventilation, so as sheets buckle, it creates openings, and that's really challenging to model. You can, if you have a video footage of an experiment, tell FDS to take out pieces of the steel. However, you can't use this in a predictive way, because as soon as we change something, what piece should disappear when? Yeah, that's not possible to do that. And then also charring. So in reality, you have a timber piece igniting and then it starts charring immediately, and it then creates gaps, small gaps for flames to pass through, and it ignites whatever is inside the dwelling. However, in FDS, all the timber are perfectly connected and you don't have charring. You need to lose the mass of an entire cell before FDS removes that piece out of the simulation, and then flames can only impinge on whatever is inside. And then also structural collapse is very difficult to simulate. Okay, yeah, so how would a statistical fire spread model work, and what would we be able to do with that then? So we had a look at this, playing with submodels of B risk, and trying to randomly populate settlements and see what we get. So we use the radiation and ignition submodel of B risk, and we benchmark that then against the 20 dwelling experiment, the triple dwelling experiments, the Imizami Yetu fire, and we added a wind feature to B risks to see whether we can predict fire spread in a slightly easier way, and then we can run the simulation for 1,000 times, for example, and try and get an average spread rate. However, a lot of work is still needed to validate and to benchmark statistical fire spread models, and some of the interesting stuff that came from this, or that can also potentially come from this, is that if we, for example, randomly generate a settlement and we run the fire spread scenario and we record the fire spread rates, and we also then record that randomly generated settlements spatial metrics, we can then start to see which spatial metrics, for example, like density, edge density, distance to first and second and third nearest neighbor, which of those spatial metrics become indicative of high fire spread rates. We can then run the spatial metrics, for instance, for Cape Town, and we can then start highlighting which informal settlements are most at risk to high fire spreads, or which areas in particular settlements are most at risk to a higher fire spread rate. And hopefully these are then some outputs that firefighters and local municipality can actually use, but we still need to do a lot of work to validate this and to refine this so that it can actually be used in practice. Okay, so yeah, that was a lot of talking. I hope you found it interesting, and yeah, let me know if you have any questions.
Woo! Thank you. Thank you, Antonio. That was really interesting. Yeah, it's I guess a problem that doesn't get covered much when you're learning about fire safety here. And so it's interesting, sort of like, particularly when you gave the number of fire deaths per year, 95% of them in informal settlements. That was really interesting, which actually leads to a question that Francesca just asked, that we just got on the thing, which she asked, the cause of death in these settlements, is that still mostly due to smoke, similar to building fires in the UK, or like in in more formal settlements, or is it something else that's causing it?
Yeah, so the cause of deaths are typically in the dwelling of origin. So it can be someone is sleeping and something ignited, and smoke inhalation, or just not waking up in time. Some of the reasons are a bit more harsh, for instance, arson related, or someone did something wrong to someone else and they could perhaps burn down a dwelling, but typically it is in the dwelling of origin, and it seems that the rest of the settlement can evacuate before the fire gets to their dwelling.
Okay, cool. Thank you. She also asked if you have any practical recommendations for like improving informal settlements, or like what, making them safer.
Yeah, so that's really difficult. I mean, the obvious one is building them further apart. That's just not practical. Another thing would be to have non-combustible lining material. I think that would be a good step forward. And then there's work going on with regards to smoke alarms in informal settlements, which seem to be working. Still some testing is needed. But it seems that if you can detect the fire really easily, the people living there can put out the fire as soon as it starts. And then also in one of our experiments we did at the end of last year, we added a polycarb sheet to the roof. So as soon as the dwelling caught fire, the polycarb sheet melted and you had all of the hot gases venting out of the roof, and you had almost no flames from the doors and the windows, which seems to be nice, but still a lot of work is needed to determine whether if all the hot gases is going out of the ceiling, do we now create new fire spread mechanisms or patterns? So we still need to investigate those, but yeah, that's potentially we can go that route, but a lot of investigation is still needed.
Yeah, it's interesting because quite a few people are asking more about the there's a couple of people asking about kind of the materials of the buildings themselves and what would it like be any different to use non-combustible materials there rather than combustible ones. But I guess that still leaves a lot of fire load inside as well.
Yeah, it leaves a lot of fire load, and the problem is like the combustible materials are free, it's lying around, you can use them, whereas if you want something non-combustible, it's not free, so who's going to pay for it? And a big issue is, let's say you go out and you take all your savings, for the people that has savings, right? And you go and buy non-combustible lining materials, and you have a perfect dwelling, but all of your neighbors have timber-clad dwellings and cardboard lining. How useful will that really be for you? So everyone needs to participate for it to work, right? And that's difficult.
Yeah, no, it's quite a big social issue, I guess. Yeah, and the because I guess we just got a question here from Wojciech about flame detection. I think that was kind of something I was interested as well. You're working a lot on this kind of like detection, fire spread, like understanding fire spread through these settlements. I was wondering if if you had a kind of research map for what you're doing. You talk about these statistical models. I was wondering how would they be used to like improve the safety of these settlements, or like what's the goals you're aiming for there?
It just gives the local municipality a starting point, at least, where they can start their focus on. And you have a lot of NGOs working within informal settlements, so that at least then gives them a place to start. And then also for the firefighters to start planning around what happens if a fire happens in the settlement. They can have some strategy going forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Well, I think that's all of them. There's one last question about enforcing separation distances. I see. Yeah, they're asking, is it possible to do any enforcement? But I guess not, from what you were saying before.
Yeah, no. So Wojciech, no. It's difficult to say, okay, we're going to do a fire break here, and we have 6 meters or 4 meters. The problem is, whose houses do you move? Where do you move them to? And if you do get them to move, whoever's next to the road will just start building into the road as soon as they need a bigger house. And then if one person starts building in, everyone will start building in, because now you're scared you're going to lose space. So it's really difficult to enforce that.
Yeah. And this will be the final question, just in case anyone else. It's asking about evacuation modelling. Do you know if any work's been done on that informal settlement? Quite interesting.
Not yet. We would love to do that. It's just going to be an absolute nightmare, because you have moving fuel loads. You have instead of people just evacuating, you have people trying to save their own dwellings, people pushing over dwellings. So there's a lot more factors at play here. But it would be very nice to look at evacuation models for informal settlements.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Antonio. That was really good. I learned a lot there. And thank you to all of you for coming and listening. If you do have any other questions for Antonio, I'm sure, would you be okay if your email was shared with people, if people wanted to get in touch?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's fine.
So I'll just we'll publish the email on our just on the chat here, I guess, on the Q&A. But if you have any more questions, you can post it there. As I said before, we've got another event coming up on the 4th of November, with Carlos Fernandez Pello. So please come along to that if you're interested. Otherwise, thank you for coming. Thank you again, Antonio. And yeah, goodbye.
Cool. Thanks so much for having me. Cheers, everyone.